In this tutorial, I'm going to go through all the basic fundamentals of watercolor that beginners need to know to sketch in my loose style. So the context of this lesson is to teach you my loose and quick line and wash sketching technique, where the main focus of the sketch at the end is really the line work. So the line work is usually the hero. So that means I've adjusted many advanced watercolor techniques to suit my sketching process. So how is it actually different? Well, it means that watercolor is a lot simpler than an artist who is creating a big watercolor painting as their artwork. So some examples of how it's different. The layers are dramatically reduced. So we're only doing a few layers compared to a big painting where you could do many, many layers. The values are often a lot lighter in my sketches. So this helps show the line work a bit better. And the colors, they don't match exactly to the reference to the photo or to what you're looking at. We simplify the colors and we match the colors that we have in our set. So we're not doing advanced mixing techniques where we're trying to match perfectly the scene. We're taking the photo and we're simplifying it to what we have. So all these changes help our sketches be really loose and quick, and the sketches can be completed in about half an hour or an hour, depending on the level you're at, compared to a watercolor painting, which can take a day or days to complete. So the big picture of my process overview, is that it is a three-step process. So the first step with these sketches here as examples, we start with the large areas of colors. They're usually the lightest areas of value. So start with a light value or a medium value, which I'll talk about later, but they cover usually the whole sketch. Then the second step is shadows. So we add in the shadow layer across all the different colors that we've done. And then the last step is adding darker spots, so that the contrast between that light layer and the very darkest layer. And they're usually smaller spots, and they're more noticeable on some sketches than others. So we're building up from light to dark in three simple layers. Okay, we're going to do an exercise, and I'm going to show you the process in depth now of how you use watercolor paint. So firstly, I've got a 7x5" watercolor piece of paper here, and I'm going to use my pen. And let's draw these concentric circles. So in the middle, I'm drawing a circle here, and it's about 1 centimeter in diameter, like that. And then let's go out a little bit further than that diameter and create another circle. And these don't have to be perfect. Don't worry if they're not perfect circles or anything. Just using this to practice. And then we'll go out even further and do another circle. So mine go crazy wobbly. And then one last one, if you've got space, a huge big one going like this around the outside. Okay, we're pretending that's our sketch. Now what do we do first? I've got my watercolors here, my paper towel, my clean water. Now some of these I've already used, so they're a bit wet. But the first thing I do is think about what colors I'm using. So I want to use a green, and I can use any brush here. I could use my normal brush. I could use an older brush to wet these, but I want to activate the colors because they're dry. So this is the Viridian green that I want to use. So I'm just going to put my whole brush in the water like that and bring it out without wiping it. It's got a big drippy amount of water there, and I'm going to put the drip into the palette, the dry one, and scrape the edge. Perhaps I'll use a yellow. So I'd put a big drip into the yellow. And I also want to use the red, the cadmium red, and I will also have the ultramarine, but they're already wet. So first step, activate your colors. Now we've got to decide what brush size to use. So it depends on what size you have, but for my size of 7x5, I usually have a range of round 10 to round 12. So if I'm doing this inner circle here, I want to choose the smaller brush. So that's an important decision, that if you're doing a large area, you don't want to be using a smaller brush. But because we're doing a small area first, let's use the round 10. And the color I want to use for that little circle in the middle is green, Viridian green. So I dip my brush fully into the water like that, and then you can scrape on the side just to get it damp again. And then I scrape into that pigment there that's really, really concentrated. This is undiluted. And I'm grabbing that and I'm putting into my palette. Scrape your brush on the side. Just keep scraping it until you've got lots of paint that you need. And now we want to bring water into there. So I put my whole brush into the water, and now there's a big drip on the end, and I'm coming over and I'm putting it in and scraping the edge of the palette there. And now that water should stay in there. Still some in my brush. So let's do it a few times. So I've done about 3 big drops of water in there, and that should be that nice lightness there. So we've gone from the water to the pan to the palette. Now we've got to transfer it to the paper. We've got a small brush, so we know that there won't be as much water going on there as if I had my big brush, but still there's a little bit of fine tuning here. Do I want to take all the water by dabbing it and bring it over as a big drip like that? But then there'll be a big puddle. So with a smaller space, I might scrape the edge of the palette like that, and you might have that's a good amount. Just scraping the palette, that's a nice transparency. We'll scrape the edge of our palette like that, and now let's paint in the middle. When you're painting here, you're holding the brush in the middle, and you're not painting on the side like this. It won't go within that space. So we're painting with the tip of our brush here. Just move it around and fill up that space. So we don't have to go right to the lines. Let's leave a little bit of white gaps if you like. And I'm just using my brush, the tip of my brush, to fill up that circle. Now there's no big puddles because I scraped the brush. Now if there was a puddle, I would dry my brush. I'm scraping the water off on the edge of the jar, and then I'd press it against the paper towel, and all the water's going to come out. So it's just slightly damp now. And then when you touch that, if there was a puddle there, for example like this one here, it's probably a better example. See, I've dried this. Now when I touch it, we watch. See how the puddle disappeared? It goes into my brush. So that process of choosing the right brush size and then taking the right amount of water from your palette and transferring it to the paper is a bit of experimentation. So test, and then when you feel comfortable with the amount, then you put it on. But if you get it wrong, which I often do, I often put too much water, then you need to tap your brush here and take the water out so that it becomes even without pulling too much. Okay, let's do the next ring, and I'm going to paint that cadmium yellow. All I'm doing is transferring this cadmium yellow to the palette, and it can be quite thick like that. So I'm putting the pigment in here, but again, too dark, it will cover up the line work. So I dip my brush in the paint and I put a big blob in, but I'm not mixing quite yet. I'm just getting another blob. And I'm looking at the size. I've put in about 3 again here, and I'm twirling it around, and I can see the white of the palette underneath, but I'm not sure. This is all about experimentation. So let's test. That looks like a good consistency. It matches this. They're about the same value, which means the darkness. So this is too dark and this was too dark, but adding water made it a lot lighter. And now this time, instead of using the point of your brush, let's try and guide it around by pointing the handle where we want to go. So I'm going to do this. See, I'm sort of pointing the handle and I'm moving the brush around, rotating it in my fingers, and go around the circle. So I'm turning my brush, pointing the handle where I want it to go. And that gives a really clean, straight edge. And when I paint, I often leave gaps. This is exaggerated, but I often leave gaps between the 2 sections. It's sort of like highlights between different areas. It makes it look more sketchy. Also, if you go over the line like this, it's okay. It's fine. So going over or under the line adds to the style. But it also helps when you're sketching. If this is still wet and you add a second color, because you're trying to put all the colors in over the whole sketch, you don't have to use your hairdryer to dry every single section so that they don't bleed into each other. Okay, so the first one was the tip of the brush. The second one was using your brush to get a nice line, more controlled. Now we're doing the bigger area here, and we'll use ultramarine. Put a bit more, and now we're going to add in the drops. So 1, 2. Now it's a bigger area here, so I might need more. So when I put in about 4 drops, so I'm mixing it. Now it's got a good consistency, and then I look over here and I'll just test to make sure. So yeah, I'm happy with that. So now I'm going to grab that paint, but this time the way we're going to sketch this, it's too big a space to do this. around the whole thing. Otherwise we'll be going around three times. So I'm going to do this sideways. So now do a sideward brush stroke. So we have a brush there and the tip is pointing towards the edge, so you can actually paint with the tip along and create that white gap between the two areas of color. So usually if you're doing a sky or a large area, you can do that. The inside edge where I was pointing is a lot cleaner, and then you can turn your brush around and now point to the outside and get some of that neater. Or even you can do now a little stroke that's pointing the direction with your handle. So now I'm cleaning my brush. You can see I'm tapping the side of the water container here, scraping it a bit. That looks clean. Okay, the last space, this big area around here, I just have a feeling that I can't do that with a round 10. There's too much area there to do. And that comes from experience, just learning your brushes as well. So I will grab a round 12 now. So I put my round 10 down. And let's do that large area on the outside. We're going to be using cadmium red. I can see there's enough paint in there and it's active. Just dampening my brush, especially if it was completely dry, and grabbing the pigment and putting it on the palette. So I'm just scraping it on. Now grab the water. Just put your brush fully in the water and one drop. Get another one, scrape, and maybe even another one. So now we're going around this outside bit, and I can probably do the handle direction strokes. So I'm going to use my handle in the right direction and just point the handle to the direction I want the line to go. Right around, and I'm not touching the blue because I don't want it to bleed into the blue. It's good practice for that. Now I've got a big blob of water and I've put it up here. But what you can do is grab it again. See, as it's moving down the page, the board is on a slight slant. I can pull it up like that. I can kind of guide it around. Now on thinner paper you can't do that. You can put all my water in here, down to the edge. So wet. So it doesn't really matter how much, but now I have to control it. So what I would do is I would wash my brush, scrape it on the side there, and take out all the water out of the brush. Like that. So tap your paper towel, and then press into this, and let's watch it soak up. See if you can do that. And I'll press it back on the paper towel, let all the water come out. I'm rotating around, and again. And I can see how even that water is. It's lightly damp here, and then it gets darker, more and more moist and very moist there. So it has a nice even amount of moisture, and I feel like that's going to dry without cauliflowering. So you can see the process here of taking the paint into the palette and mixing and adding water, testing, making sure that we have the right value, and then applying it to the paper. But then if you see that it's not quite right, we have to then control the watercolor using the paper towel, washing our brush, and controlling how much we have here. And all that process of development you'll learn over time by experimentation and knowing what your paper can do and how much water you need to put in there. Now we're going to talk about value. You heard me talking about it with the last exercise where I was experimenting with value. But when I'm sketching, I use 3 different values: the light value, medium value, and dark value. So let's have a go at doing this together. So I want you to get a bit of watercolor paper, and once again we've got our colors that are already active, so I can see there. So I'm going to dampen my brush, and then I'll get some of the pigment from the ultramarine, put it up there, and then we add water to it. So we want it to be very light, and I'll just test over here. That's very light. Can even add even more water. So there's a lot of water there. It's about 5 drops to 1 little scrape of pigment. So I'll put it up the top here, and I'm going to do all my brush strokes side on like this, just to get the area. And see, that has a very light consistency. Now if you want to make it a bit darker, we just have to add more paint from the pan into the palette. So I can get more pigment or paint. So you can test on the side. There, yep. So now let's do the medium consistency, medium value. You can add a bit more. Now the last one, we add a lot of pigment, so let's grab a lot more into there. I usually only do little dots or splatters on the page, little dots like this in my sketch, but here we're doing a lot bigger space. So there, we've got the different consistencies. Let's do the next one. Let's do the red. So once again, grabbing the pigment, and we'll put it down here, and then we want lots of water for the light one. That's looking good. So let's do that across there. Now it's had a bit more. So now let's control, let's see, that's looking better, a bit darker. Yeah, that's good. So I'm using the side brush here. Now I want to do my dark layer, so I'm adding more pigment. But let's do this here. That would be very dark for me. So grab the cadmium yellow, bit of pigment there. Now let's place. It's 2, 3, 4, 5. Test. It's very light. Just you can see the line work, so that would be great. But then we can add some more pigment to your palette. Now test. Oh, that's quite strong. I might add a bit of water back. So it's this adjustment, and then go through here. And now my last one, lots of paint. I know that's quite thick. So that's how I control the water, adding the pigment to the palette and adding lots of water, and then testing, putting it on the paper and then adjusting it. So some of these weren't quite right, so I added a bit more, or I took out the paint. But hopefully you can see that general process that I go through. And if you can master this simple technique of controlling the watercolor, adjusting, it'll go a long way for you to improving your sketches, improving your watercolor. So that's my very basic overview of using watercolors. On Patreon, we'll be going much more in depth on the materials. So looking at all the paper, the brushes, the paints, and I'll show you all the materials in depth. And then I'll also talk about the common problems that you get more in depth. So like cauliflowering, bleeding, streaking, we'll go through that too. So if you're interested in that tutorial is over on my Patreon membership. Plus there's a whole collection of fundamentals for beginners for my loose sketching style on other subjects, plus tutorial projects which you can do, and a great warm friendly community where you can post your sketch and ask me a question. Otherwise, there's another tutorial right here on YouTube. Thank you so much for joining me, and I'll see you in the next one.